I'm not sure. I think we can just start it now.
Okay, maybe. Okay, so then, okay.
So
can you see it now? Yeah, yes. Okay, welcome back.
Welcome the paper mulberry master.
Okay, so should I start all over again or?
Yeah, all over again, please.
Okay, well, thank you for coming back. And okay, my name is Kuo-Fang Chung. I'm an associate research fellow at the Academia Sinica Biodiversity Research Center. The talk I'm going to show you is a very unique journey of myself. I'm a botanist. By definition, we study plants. But accidentally, I studied this tree and have a very interesting and very, for me, it's a really remarkable journey to really study this anthropology. So it's very, so for me, it's a very, I like to share this with you. Okay, so this talk, I will divide into three components. The first is, I will explain to you guys what is Austronesian-speaking people, or I will just use Austronesian. And when I say Austronesian, means Austronesian-speaking people. And I will also introduce you the idea of agricultural package and the commensal species. And the second part is I will introduce you the paper mulberry tree and how paper mulberry tree was used to make a tapa cloth or bark cloth. Then I will show you guys the evidence that how we use DNA of paper mulberry tree to test hypothesis of Austronesian expansion and migration. And please feel free to stop me at any time. Okay. And the first is what is Austronesian? And prior to colonial period, Austronesian were the most widely spoken language group. And so this figure shows the distribution of Austronesian-speaking people. They started from the Madagascar, the Indian Ocean island on the west to the east is Easter Island, or we would call Rapa Nui. And the north limit of the language is from Taiwan to Hawaii. And the southern limit is New Zealand. Okay, and you can see that the distribution was very, very wide, including all the islands, Southeast Asia, and the coastal area of the New Guinea island, and also all the area we call Micronesia, Polynesia, and a large area of what we call Melanesia. And this language group comprise approximately 1,200 different languages. They are spoken by more than 380 million people. Okay, and as I mentioned, prior to colonial expansion, Austronesians are the most widely spoken language group. Okay. And what exactly Austronesian language? I'm going to show you a video clip. And this Professor Lee of Taiwan, he interviewed different Austronesian-speaking people and used an example of how I was said in different Austronesian language. So this is about 2 minutes. Oh, this is Pudong people. This is the Sayaya people. They call Mada. So this is Puyuma people. They call Mada. And this is, I don't know how to say that in English, a very small group. They call it Mada. This is Dao people. They live in a very small island, southeast coast of Taiwan. Mada. This is Baiwan people in the south. This is called the Ai. This lady is Rukai, also a southern tribe, called Mada. This is from Malaysia. Mada. This is Chamorro people in Guam. And this is a Philippine people.
In your native tongue, how do you call the eye?
They call I Mada also. This lady from Indonesia, Central Java. He called I Mada as well. And this is in Easter Island, Rapa Nui.
But the word Mata has another meaning, eyes. The eyes of the ancestors which imbued the statues with power.
Okay. So, so as you can see that they share a lot of the language, the common language. So the linguists can really study them as a whole group, and also share a lot of the culture. For example, tattoo is a word of Austronesian language, and tattoo is also a very important culture. Almost all the Austronesian-speaking people have this tattooing culture. Okay, and why Austronesian-speaking people are interested? Because the history of their peopling or colonization of the remote oceanic island is the last episode of Neolithic human migration. So for archaeology and anthropologists, when we're trying to understand how the Neolithic people have colonized the remote area on previously unpeoplized the area, Austronesian-speaking people provide a very, very unique study group to let us to understand how our ancestors overcome this difficulty to settle a very difficult area. Okay, but there are some really interesting or remarkable question about the Austronesian-speaking people. Is although linguistically they appear to be very uniform, but physically they look very different. And this photo shows some of the Austronesian-speaking people I met along my journey. And so you can see some Taiwanese indigenous people here. And this is what we call Philippine people. And they actually have a very dark skin, and they are much short, and they have a curly hair with a flat nose. And this is people from Java, and these are people from New Britain, Papua New Guinea. And this is from Oro province. And this is a lady from Palau, and this is a lady from Marquesas. These two ladies are from Hawaii, and this lady is from Rapa Nui. Okay, and so basically, what we're looking at is a culturally or linguistically homogeneous group, but physically very, very different people. Okay, so because of this, there are actually two questions related to Austronesian-speaking people. The first is people want to know what is the genetic origin of Southeast Asian people, because they are physically very diverse. And also the anthropologists, they want to understand the geographic origin of the prehistorical migration of the Austronesian-speaking people. Okay, and basically in archaeology, there are two major hypotheses to explain the physical diverse of the Austronesian Southeast Asian people. One is called regional continuity model. The other one is called two-layer hypothesis. And basically, at this moment, a majority of the archaeology and the anthropology accept a so-called two-layer hypothesis. They believe that the reason people here are so diverse is because there are two groups of people they mix together. There are a first wave of people, they migrate from continental Asia into this Southeast Asia during the Ice Age. They arrived in Australia approximately 65 to 50,000 years ago. Okay, then there's a second wave of migration coming out from southern China, bypass Taiwan, get into island Southeast Asia. And this group of people is what we call, this blue line is the expansion of Austronesian-speaking people. And they actually intermix in this region. And that is the reason why the people in this region are so diverse, because you have two layers of people, they have different kind of degree of mixing. Okay. And in terms of the origin of prehistorical expansion and migration of Austronesian-speaking people, there are several different models or hypotheses. And one of the most dominant and almost of most people accept is what we call a farming language dispersal hypothesis. And this is aligned with the so-called of Taiwan hypothesis, okay? And the reason they have this hypothesis is because based on a historical linguistic study, an American linguist called Robert Blast, he classified some 1,200 different Austronesian languages into 10 different groups. 9 of them were spoken exclusively by the indigenous population in Taiwan. And the rest of the more than 1,100 different languages belong to what we call Malayo-Polynesian language group. Because Taiwan has the highest linguistic diversity, as well as some like a characteristic showing the language is very old in Taiwan. So based on the linguistic data, Taiwan was proposed as an Austronesian ancestral homeland. Okay, and an Australian archaeologist named Peter Bellwood, he integrated Robert Blast's linguistic model with the farming language hypothesis. His idea is approximately about 6,000 years ago, people living in southern China, they were the so-called proto-Austronesian-speaking people. They were farmers already. And because about 6,000 years ago, people living in this area, they have already adopted a farming culture. People start to cultivate their own food. And because of this, cultural society, population start to expand. And the growth of the population and also the competition from the northern China, the so-called Han Chinese. Some people live in southern China. They are forced to migrate because they need to seek more land. And so they migrate across Taiwan Strait, arrive in Taiwan approximately 5,500 years ago. And when they arrive in Taiwan, there's already some more primitive hunter-gatherer society, not probably hunter-gathering, live in Taiwan. And these people from southern China, they were farmers, so they were able to they find the land, so they start to do a lot of agriculture in Taiwan. And because Taiwan is a relatively sizable island, so they start to diversify. And about 1,000 years after they arrive in Taiwan, the land becoming because of the growth of the population, some small group of people started to migrate south again, approximately 4,200 years ago, and they arrived in Philippines. And because they were agricultural people, they are quickly replaced the people, the hunter-gatherer living in this region. So they moved rapidly from Philippines into island Southeast Asia, for example, Borneo. Then they went to Sulawesi, and they arrived in New Guinea approximately 3,000 to 3,400 years ago. And here because they meet with a group of people living in inland New Guinea, they could not actually really get into the island because inland New Guinea people already have agricultural skill. So they kind of like stay in the coastal area, and they arrived in this region about 3,000 years ago. And then there's about 1,000 years ago a lake. They, again, because of the invention of some advanced setting skill, they moved again into Polynesian. And by 1,000 years ago, they already occupy all the island, almost all the island in the Pacific. And because these Austronesian-speaking people, they are farmers. And the idea is because they have this advantage over the hunter-gatherer, the language expand along with the farming technology. Okay. But there are alternative hypotheses. One is they argue Austronesian-speaking people, they are sea nomads. They migrate because they seek the trade opportunity. And along with the trade, the languages start to expand. So some people argue that Austronesian language is actually a trade language. And this language is a result of a long-term development in Southeast Asia, nothing to do with the so-called people from southern China and Taiwan, okay? And so the idea of the farmer language hypothesis is that Austronesian-speaking people are farmers. And one of the very important things, if you guys have opportunity to visit all those Pacific islands, you will realize agriculture is a very, very important thing. And that is when you visit different islands, you will immediately recognize their village look very similar. They grow very similar kind of crop. The village have very similar style. And so the idea is that along with their migration, they move from one island to the island and they transport the landscape. And so for example, this is a very typical traditional Polynesian village. You can see the taro growing, the banana, coconut tree, and have this like a different kind of the agricultural product, okay? And you will see pig, chicken. This is all component of the Polynesian village, okay? And so this animal and the crop they grow or they cultivate have a very tight relationship with the Austronesian people. So, so when they migrate, this animal or plant species was transported along with this migration. And so this organism, what we call Pacific commensal species, provide a very interesting study subject, because if we can trace the migration of this crop or animal, we can try to understand how the Austronesian people migrate. This approach is what we call a commensal approaches, okay? So when the first application of the commensal approach is the study of the Pacific rat, okay? So in the Pacific Islands, a lot of the island, you can find this very invasive rat. They were actually intentionally or accidentally transported along with the migration of Austronesian people. Almost all the island, Pacific Island, you can see this rat, and they were the very important protein for the lay people, okay? So scientists, the scientists study the DNA of the rat and trying to understand the migration of the rat, okay? And this is what they found. And this is a study, one of the earliest study published in 1998. So they find that this rat, basically, all the Pacific rat have arrived from Samoa into this central Polynesia, and the rat was transported to Hawaii and transported to this Society Island. They were transported to New Zealand and transported to this island. Okay, so based on the study of the DNA of the rat, we can really see that the navigation ability of these Polynesian people are really remarkable. Okay, after subsequent to the rat study, people started to investigate the DNA of the Pacific pig. And one of the important finding of the pig is that basically there are two groups of pig transported into the Pacific. One is originated from southern China, Taiwan, and the Philippines, but the one actually get into Polynesia was actually from Indochina. And so this pig idea basically kind of like reject the idea of our Taiwan hypothesis, because the pig in the Pacific apparently did not come in from Taiwan. Instead, they come in from Indochina. Another interesting study is the chicken. Chicken is the most important Austronesian commensal animal. Almost all the village, all the Austronesian-speaking people village have the chicken. Okay, they are also the most widely consumed meat around the world now. And a very remarkable study of the chicken is that scientists was actually find a fossil chicken bone on Andes. And the bone was carbon dated approximately 1,000 years ago. And that bone was much, much older than the discovery, the so-called Columbus discovery of the New World. And the chicken bone and the DNA provide a very strong evidence suggesting that the Austronesian migration did not stop in Rapa Nui or Easter Island. They actually arrived in South America, okay? And another remarkable example of this commensal organism is the sweet potato. Sweet potato is a crop very widely cultivated in South America, and it's very clearly a South American originated crop species. But during the 18th century, when the Europeans they navigate across the Pacific, the sweet potato was already very widely cultivated across all the Pacific Islands. So the study of Pacific sweet potato suggesting that the sweet potato is very likely taken by Austronesian ancestors back to the Western Pacific Island, providing a very strong evidence for the so-called pre-Columbus contact of the Austronesian-speaking people with the South American Andes people. Okay. Another study is the breadfruit, Artocarpus. Breadfruit is one of the most important starch crop for the Austronesian-speaking people. All the Pacific Islands have the breadfruit, very, very, very important crop. But the study of the breadfruit suggesting a very complicated origin of Pacific breadfruit, and also show ancient and recent human migration. And the reason is because the breadfruit is so important. This crop is still widely traded and exchanged across the Pacific. So it's actually very difficult to really pinpoint the exact origin of this crop, and also not to say to reconstruct the migration of these people, of the Austronesian-speaking people. So because there's actually no evidence, all study of the commensal species can trace Taiwan origin. So actually people start to question, is this of Taiwan hypothesis is a good hypothesis, okay? And actually, there are even scientists, they actually suggesting that Austronesian migration is a failed agricultural revolution, okay? And across all the Pacific commensal species, a very important and very interesting example is paper mulberry tree. Paper mulberry tree is a dioecious tree species, meaning the trees have both male and female trees separately. Most of the plant are what we call bisexual. They have both male and female flower in the same flower or in the same plant. But paper mulberry is different. Paper mulberry have a male tree and female tree. Okay, so you need a male tree and female tree together to reproduce seed. If you have only male and female tree, there's no way you can have sexual reproduction. Okay, this tree is native to China, Taiwan, and Indochina, and the fruit is dispersed by animal. They are very common in the disturbed habitat in Taiwan and southern China. They have a very long fiber in the inner bark, and they are very, very aggressive root suckers. And so this is what paper mulberry look like. This is a photo this was a tree taken about 10 minutes walking from my office. You can see sorry?
What is root sucker?
Root sucker means, I will show you root sucker later. Okay, thank you. Yeah, just, okay. So, okay, but this just to show you that the leaf is very variable, okay. So this shows the male tree and the female tree. On the left side is the male tree. They flower in springtime, about March, April in Taiwan. And this inflorescence is what we call a cake time. They have this like a drooping, very, very tiny flower congregate in this structure we call inflorescence. On the right side is the female flower, and this is the fruit, okay? So when you have both male tree and female tree, you will produce a fruit like this. And this fruit provide a very important abundant food for the low elevation animal in Taiwan in the summertime. It's a very, very common, and very often you will see the food like this, like they drop on the ground, okay? And they will attract many, many animals, okay? And so, because of their fruit is very juicy and delicious, the seeds got dispersed everywhere in Taiwan. So you can see this tree along the riverbank, in a ditch side, this like drainage ditch, on a wall, on the street. This is in the central Taipei. Basically, you can see this tree everywhere, okay? But this tree also occurs in some very scenic area in Taiwan. For example, on the left side is the Taroko Gorge in Taiwan. And this is a tree taken not far away from Taipei 101, iconic building of Taipei. Okay, but paper mulberry is really common, but it's really one of the most neglected tree species in Taiwan. And this photo was taken in front of the main gate of Academia Sinica. Many people bypass this tree but never pay attention to this tree. Okay, this tree also have very, very strong fiber. You can see this if you like try to break this trees, break this bark. You can see this white part. This white part is what we call an inner bark, and this inner bark have one of the longest fibers of any tree species, and this longest fiber was one of the major sources to make a paper. Indeed, the scientific name of paper mulberry is called Broussonetia papyrifera. The tree is used to make a paper. Actually, 2,000 years ago, the Chinese Cai Lun it was documented that Cai Lun used paper mulberry tree to make a paper. Okay, but in the Pacific, there is something very interesting. Is that in the native range in East Asia, including Taiwan, China, you find both male and female paper mulberry trees. But in the Pacific, most of the literature document the plant never set fruit there. And they use a root sucker for propagation. Okay, so what is root sucker? Basically, this tree, they have their root system can grow and they can pop out, becoming a new individual. So this is what we call root suckers. Paper mulberry is one of the most aggressive root suckers. If you have one paper mulberry tree planted, within a few years, they will just expand by root sucker. So basically, you can just cut down the root and you plant it, you will get a new tree. So it's a very, very relatively easy to grow paper mulberry tree. But that also means when you have this tree grow, it's very hard to get rid of them. Okay. So this is how they grow the tree in Tonga. This is a paper mulberry plantation in Tonga. Okay, but why they grow this tree is because they use the tree to make a very special kind of textile called tapa cloth or bar cloth. And one of the earliest record of the tapa cloth was recorded in James Cook's journal of their Pacific voyage. He says that basically James Cook, when he visited Pacific, he documented everything he saw and very precisely. And so he recorded the Tahitian cloth. Okay, so he says that all their clothes, I believe, is made from the bark of the tree. The finest is made from a plant which they cultivated for no other purposes. Dr. Solander, which is a very famous botanist at that time, think it is the same plant, the bark of which the Chinese make paper of, beating out the proper breast finest with a wooden beater. Okay, I will show you a video clip and you will get an idea of how this was made. So this is in Tonga.
This one.
So this is a paper mulberry tree here.
In English, they call it mulberry.
Should be paper mulberry.
As Tonga, we call it hiapo.
Hiapo.
We cut it down. We take the skin out.
So you can see the leaf here.
And then we beat it to become paper thin. Usually
so
about this wide, and then we join it up to your desired width and your length.
So you can see the inner bark here. And this is how they beat the cloth. They beat and kind of like expand the fiber. And you expand, become a very big cloth. And it was a very important, this is actually the major clothes they have before the Western textile imported.
Mainly for clothing, first originally for clothing, and then as gifts for weddings and funerals, special birthdays, anything venerable, anyone you decide to give to, you give.
Okay, so this shows you guys how the tapa cloth was made. But if you can see that this guy from Tonga, the cloth he wears is just a textile we wear. It's not a tapa cloth, and because this scene is actually it's a more like an iconic thing. It was no longer a daily use thing. Okay, and this is this lady. Her name is Delaney. She's a tapa artist from Hawaii, and she shows that through this process beating, you can expand the fiber into a very big cloth. Okay, and by the way, in Hawaii, this is called kapa. And tapa is actually becoming a very, very important thing it's actually a very important thing in Austronesian culture, especially in the Pacific. This figure was drawn by a German painter in the late 19th century in Fiji. It shows that a Fijian chief, this chief, he wear more than 180 meters of tapa cloth during a ceremony to make a conclusion of 100 days of mourning for a permanent chief of Fiji. And because of tapa is actually, you have to spend a lot of energy to produce tapa cloth. So the amount of tapa you possess is the symbol of your status and your wealth. And so this figure shows the importance of tapa in the Austronesian culture, okay? And nowadays, in many Pacific islands, for example, Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, the tapa cloth is still a culturally very, very important thing. And this actually, for example, this one on the bottom right was in this gathering, they sit on a big tapa cloth. They chat, they discuss the important issues, okay? And nowadays, the tapa have turned into a very unique and very fashionable material. For example, this bride and bridesmaid, they all have this tapa cloth during the wedding, okay? And so this photo are taken in Papua New Guinea 2 years ago in the Tufi and Tapa Tattoo Festival. As you can see that these people, they wear this tapa cloth in their ceremony, and which really shows the cultural importance of tapa cloth, okay? And this is in the ceremony, people are wearing different tribe in the region, all different culture, they all wear tapa cloth. Okay, I'm going to show you this video clip of the festival. Yeah. So this is what they call Sing Sing, a festival. They keep dancing for 2 days, and they basically different tribe, different clans, they will compete during this ceremony. Okay. Sorry. Okay. And Perry mulberry, based on the literature, we know it was Perry mulberry that was used to make tapa cloth in the Pacific. And this is a specimen, is a plant collected during James Cook's first journey in the mid-18th centuries. And this specimen was preserved in the National History Museum, the British National History Museum. I've seen this specimen myself, and it's clearly a paper mulberry tree. So we know what James Cook and those voyagers they see was paper mulberry tree in the Pacific, suggesting that paper mulberry was really widely cultivated across the Pacific island, okay? So based on this information, we think paper mulberry can provide a very interesting subject to study the Austronesian expansion and migration, because they provide a very unique closing aspect of the Austronesian migration, okay? Because they were the prime material for making tapa cloth, they were very widely cultivated across Pacific, but their native range likely including China, Taiwan, and Indochina. And this happens to be a proposed so-called homeland for Austronesian expansion and migration. They were clonally and ancestry propagated, suggesting that they can preserve an ancient migration. And because of they were clonal, and also they had no close relative of the Pacific, so they won't have hybridization. Okay, and also because tapa culture has been abandoned or becoming only culturally important, this is likely preserve ancient migration history, and this really compared with other crops such as breadfruit, which is still very important, a food crop. And because they are important, they were still traded, imported, exported. So it's become less likely to preserve an ancient migratorial signature, okay? And also because paper mulberry was cultivated in Pacific Island, so paper mulberry tree is a crop in the Pacific. if we can somehow study this tree, we can really show that the Austronesian are actually farmers, because only a farmer will bother to maintain this tree species. Okay. And so as a scientist, as a botanist, I see this as a very unique opportunity to test using paper mulberry DNA to test the Austronesian expansion and migration hypothesis. Specifically, I would like to test the of Taiwan hypothesis. And I think if we can provide evidence for the following question, then we will provide very strong evidence. The first is we ask if is paper mulberry tree really native to Taiwan, and if the Pacific paper mulberry tree originates from Taiwan. And also, I would like to know is Pacific paper mulberry actually is sexually propagated, or this is just some misrecord, a wrong record in the literature. And also, I want to able to show that was paper mulberry tree was introduced in ancient time, or alternatively, this might be a very recent event. Okay, and then I would like to know is the history of paper mulberry transportation congruent with anthropological hypothesis of Austronesian migration. Okay, so in order to answer this question, we started our journey. We traveled really far and wide. We started from Taiwan, of course, and when we traveled to southern China and we went to Vietnam. My student Xiaolei went to Vietnam. We went to Sulawesi, went to Papua New Guinea. My student went to Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, and our collaborator from Chile, they conduct also very extensive field trip in all this island. Okay, and this is show you our field trip. This is my trip to Uyaku. It was started from a very remote area in Tufi. Then I took a 2-hour dinghy ride to this village called Uyaku to find this tree. And also, one of the major challenges of finding the tree is because this tree was cultivated, it's not a native tree species in this region. It's very, very hard to find a tree unless you know who grew it. So we rely on the herbarium records to know which village have the paper mulberry tree. And this specific example is a specimen collected for a very remote village in Papua New Guinea. Okay, and with this information, we conduct 3 field trip to Papua New Guinea. And this is just show you guys what the road of Papua New Guinea look like. And this is what the bridge look like. This almost all bridge we across it just look like that. Okay, and this is how we find a tree. When we got a village, we need to find an interpreter, local guy, and we have this piece of paper asking people, you guys know this plant? Because they don't know, each village have different names. So you need to find the interpreter to know the right name and just ask people, okay? And most of the people say, oh, we know this tree, but we no longer have this tree because we don't know, we no longer make a tobacco. So a lot of people, especially older generation, all those trees, or they will say, oh, we have this tree, but you have to work for like 3 days, okay? So it was not a very easy process, okay? But sometimes, finally, we find a tree, okay? This is a village called Arufa, and we find this tree. It's very, very, very happy to find this tree, of course, okay? And also because this tree used to be very widely cultivated, but many islands, they no longer have the tree. So we also trying to get the DNA from this ancient or herbarium specimen. For example, this specimen was collected from in 1899 from a very small island called Nui Island. Nui is no longer have the paper mulberry tree. The culture was totally disappeared. But there are a few herbarium specimens preserved in herbarium. So we have the permission to get a leaf and to get a DNA, okay? And then when we had a material, how do we study this? And just show you how the DNA functions. So this is a piece of DNA. And one of the important property of DNA is they will replicate from 1 DNA to 2 DNA, okay? And so this DNA replication is the process of when you produce your next generation, DNA will replicate. And because of this process, we can actually trace back the replication of DNA. This process is what we call coalescence. Coalescence means you have two DNA merge into one DNA. Okay. Also, another very important property of DNA is when DNA replicate, sometimes, most of the time, they were very precise, but sometimes there are some mutation. When there's a mutation, you have a new DNA sequence. For example, the original one is T, and when there's a mutation, you mutate from T to A. And this DNA mutation is very important because without mutation, they won't have any genetic variation for natural selection. Then they won't have a biodiversity. Okay, and when the time goes by, they will have more mutation. Okay, then when we survey the contemporary DNA sequences, we will recall different DNA type, and this different DNA sequence type is what we call a haplotype. Then based on a simple mathematics, we can link this haplotype together, and then we can turn the different haplotype into what we call a haplotype network. And I'm going to show you some network later, and this network actually tell you something very simple, but very important. For example, based on this haplotype network, we know that haplotype 2 derived from haplotype 1, and haplotype 5 was derived from haplotype 4. And based on mathematical model, we know that we need a haplotype here, which is missing because of it's disappeared or because we did not sample. But mathematically, you need something here to connect this haplotype. And this relationship also lets us know that haplotype 1 is older than haplotype 2. Haplotype 4 is older than haplotype 5. Based on this information, we can make a lot of the calculation in terms of the evolution of the different haplotype. Then we can infer the ancestry of the different haplotype. Okay, so we have after we survey and collect and survey the DNA variation in 2015, we have our first major publication, and this is the team member. This is Dr. Zhishan Zhang, who is the person who have this idea. This is my graduate student Xiaolei, who in charge of the collecting of most of the DNA sequence data, and Andrea and Daniela, my collaborator from Chile. Okay, so in our first study, we survey the Kuo-Fang region, and we use a small chunk of DNA called NDHF2032. It's a small chunk of DNA, but show a very, very high genetic diversity. Okay, and this allows us to able to know the genetic variation of the paper mulberry across the Pacific. Okay, so in this study, we sample about 600 different paper mulberry trees across the Pacific, and these 600 different paper mulberry trees, the haplotype they carry can be classified into 48 different haplotypes. And this different circle is different haplotype. And this shows the evolutionary relationship of this haplotype. And this is what we call a haplotype network, okay? And as you can see from this network, the East Asian region, including China, Taiwan, and the Philippines, is quite colorful, suggesting this region have a much, much higher genetic diversity. And based on population genetic theories, we know that this region, including East Asia, including China, Taiwan, and the Philippines, and Vietnam, are the most likely ancestral and also the native range of paper mulberry tree. Okay, in comparison, the Pacific region have a very, very uniform genetic variation, suggesting the Pacific is an introduced range of the paper mulberry tree. And this is also congruent with the hypothesis that the paper mulberry was introduced into Pacific from somewhere else. Okay, and this is just show you that this was I trying to mark the haplotype by the distribution range. As you can see that the green color means Taiwan, yellow is China, and this blue color is Indochina. Anyway, basically, China has the highest haplotype. You can find 26 different haplotypes in China. Taiwan, although a relatively small island, we have 19 different haplotypes. Okay, but anyway, Taiwan, China, Indochina have very, very high genetic variation in compared to the Pacific region. Okay. And then we ask, what is the genetic origin of the Pacific paper mulberry tree? Okay, and as you can see from this figure, a majority of the paper mulberry tree in Pacific have a red haplotype. Okay, and except for Hawaii, which also have a haplotype 41 in light blue. Okay, and if we just look at this haplotype tree, we can conclude that very, very low genetic variation in the Pacific, suggesting this Pacific paper mulberry had undergone a very severe bottleneck or founder effect, meaning only very, very limited genetic variation have been transported into the Pacific. This is congruent with the idea that the Pacific paper mulberry is not native. They were not originated there. They were brought into the area. And they are also congruent that they are most likely a clonal event. They were not a sexually reproduced population. Otherwise, they will have a higher genetic variation. Okay, and also, except for the Pacific, this CP17, the red haplotype, is only found in Taiwan, specifically Southeast Taiwan. Okay, this relationship suggests very strongly that Pacific paper mulberry have a genetic origin from southern Taiwan, okay, and suggesting that Taiwan is the ancestral homeland of Pacific paper mulberry, and this is congruent with Taiwan as an Austronesian ancestral homeland, okay, and so this provides a very first ethnobotanic support for the out of Taiwan hypothesis, okay, and but this study published in 2015 has many unanswered questions. The first is, what is the geographic origin of Hawaii and CP41? And thus, we can use more genetic data, actually genomic data, to support this of Taiwan scenario, okay? And because of the lack of genetic variation within the Pacific, we don't know the exact pattern of transportation. And also, we don't know when a tree was introduced into the Pacific. So we used a genomic tool, which basically we just get much more DNA sequences to address this question. Okay, so this is unpublished data, but I just want to show you what we have. Basically, based on much more DNA sequence data, we can show that the DNA of this paper mulberry tree can be separated into two major groups. One is from this, the yellow one is from China, and the green one is from Taiwan. And the Pacific paper mulberry is genetically much closer to the population from Taiwan. And the CP41, which is from Hawaii, is genetically closer to southern China. Okay, so suggesting, this is another way to show this variation. So this is what we call network analysis. You can see that all the sample Pacific paper mulberry can be classified into two genetic groups. The one on the left side, including all the sample from China and some sample from Hawaii, which carry CP41. And all the Pacific paper mulberry carry CP71 is genetically very closely to the population in Taiwan. Specifically, they are very close to population from Southeast Taiwan. And this is actually highly congruent with the anthropological hypothesis, which suggesting Southeast Taiwan is the ancestral homeland of the Austronesian expansion and migration. Okay, sorry. Okay, so this is just give you a better idea of what we find that the oceanic or Pacific paper mulberry derived from this region. Okay. And then we want to know when was the paper mulberry was transported into the Pacific. Okay, and our colleague Selen from they a few years ago they were able to find that there's a tapaclose found in basically a 16th century old tablecloth found in the island of Tahiti, a small island of Tahiti island group. And they used a carbon date to show that this was from 16th centuries. And based on DNA analysis, they also know this tablecloth was made of the paper mulberry tree, suggesting in 16th centuries, paper mulberry tree was already present in the Pacific Island. Okay, but this is actually not all enough to congruent with Austronesian expansion and migration. So our team, we sequenced the whole Chloroplast genome, basically just get more DNA data, and we apply a technique called molecular dating, and we were able to show that paper mulberry was transported from Taiwan into the Pacific. They left Taiwan approximately 4,500 years ago. And they followed this very beautiful chronology from west to east, with the eastern population are the newest arrival. And this basically was the chronology of this transportation. The history of the paper mulberry transportation derived from the Chloroplast genome data was highly congruent with the anthropological hypothesis. Okay. Then we want to know the history of Austronesian expansion, the paper mulberry transportation. And so basically, based on this genetic variation, we were able to show that paper mulberry is native to Taiwan, and the paper mulberry tree is originated from Taiwan. And the Pacific paper mulberry is essentially propagated. And the Pacific paper mulberry was also introduced in the ancient time. And also the history of paper mulberry transportation is highly congruent with the anthropological hypothesis of Austronesian migration, okay? So basically, we were able to show that paper mulberry tree is indeed transported along with the migration of the Austronesian expansion and migration, providing a very, very strong support for the Taiwan hypothesis, okay? And this is the Disney animation Moana. Okay, I bet you guys probably have watched this animation before. I really like this one because this actually is a story about Austronesian migration in the Polynesian based on Polynesian oral culture. And this animation is actually in a lot of detail, really, they try to follow in the detail, but I would argue they miss something. Basically, I don't see any paper mulberry tree in the animation. So I made this to show that it's very important in their culture. Okay, so all the stuff I just mentioned to you can be seen in this open museum idea. We make a online exhibit to showcase our study. Okay, with that, this is a teamwork. So I would like to thank the funding from Academia Sinica and a lot of my collaborator and my student assistant, and especially a very capable assistant of my lab, and also my collaborator, Andrea and Daniela. And also I thank my current collaborator from Papua New Guinea for helping with the material from Papua New Guinea, and also our next generation sequence facility. Okay, then thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh,
So
this is wonderful.
now? Yes. Okay.
Just one thing, like I think they don't, our remote artists, they don't know Cai Lun. You were mentioning him. That Cai Lun was we recognize he was the first paper inventor in Chinese history.
Okay, so what should I do now?
I think maybe we have some questions, and now we are open to everyone. So if you have any question, please you can, or anything you are interested, you can ask him now. But yeah, but to me, I think this really inspired me. How you can look back to the history and how, but this is the you explained it. You explain it with the migration of plants and how the agricultural technology influenced the anthropology migration. And I think by the same module, maybe, for example, the greenhouse technology could be, I mean, the same module, same theory could apply to the greenhouse technology, because this is the modern agriculture, and we have the modern situation, which is the climate warming, climate issues. So that I just think that could inspire us. I mean, for the future.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for your comment. Really, for me, this is a unexpected journey of myself, because for me, this study have several components. First is pale mulberry tree is, I don't know if you guys recognize this tree at all. It was actually, if you live in Taiwan, this, and if you are from China, southern China, central to southern China, or you're from northern Vietnam, this tree was so common. It's one of the least, it was almost everywhere. And but this tree actually has kind of like been forgotten, because it used to be very, very important. As you mentioned, Cai Lun, apparently in the old day, they use the fiber to make a, actually, there's a series. Cai Lun did not invent the paper from scratch. He was inspired by the tapa making, the barcloth culture in southern China at the time, in the Eastern Han Dynasty. Actually, based on the ancient literature, the scene, the tapa cloth was actually present in Chinese history. It just disappeared now. But if you really dug very deep into the literature, there are something we can almost certain it was a barcloth. And Cai Lun, if you have the chance to look at the barcloth, I don't know, I have some barcodes here. If you can, how can I turn on the camera? If you can let me know. How should I turn on the camera?
I think that if you, on the bottom left of the screen.
Can you guys see me? You guys see me?
No.
No?
You are still in the PPT.
How should I?
Button left. Oh, just click the share screen button again.
Okay, and okay. Yeah, I actually not really good with this kind of thing.
You are very good at the paper mulberry.
I just don't know how to leave this window. It's also, okay, here. I should close my PowerPoint, okay? Okay, can you see me now? This is a piece of paper mulberry. A tapa cloth. Yeah, tapa cloth.
No, we cannot see.
You cannot see me?
No. Click the start video at the 左下方。
停止视讯 Okay?
No. I think Zoom blocked you.
Zoom blocked me. Okay. Anyway, you just search for tapa cloth. You will be able to find the material. And if you had the chance to touch the material, it's actually essentially a very thick paper. So barcloth is essentially a paper. So they were materially very, very similar thing. So Cai Lun, there are some theories that Cai Lun was actually inspired by the making of the tapa cloth. And he realized that if you can, this is a very cheap material. The bark is everywhere, so you can make it into paper. So one thing amazed me is that I think paper mulberry tree is a very, very important tree, but it was actually long forgotten. So what we're trying to do is trying to make people know this is a very important tree. And although a lot of people don't like this tree because it's too aggressive, too weedy. But this tree actually in the Pacific Island is actually disappearing because they are clonal. And because it was a clone, it was actually weak. It was because they are not derived from a sexual reproduction. So they were very weak. So for example, in Hawaii, James Cook documented the tree was very widely planted across the archipelago. But nowadays, you rarely see any paper mulberry tree in the wild. They only survive in the botanic garden now. Yeah, so it's actually something very, very important culturally, but also disappearing very quickly. So this is another thing we're trying to do now is because we need to preserve this ancient crop. Okay, the paper mulberry in the Pacific is actually based on our current data. It was a result of artificial selection. They were genetically actually different from our paper mulberry tree in Taiwan. Although they were derived from Taiwan, but genetically they are very different now. So they actually preserve an ancient signature of the human domestication. So that is a very, very interesting issue. And in essence, the genome of the Pacific paper mulberry was frozen at about 4,000 years ago. So by studying their genome, it actually can provide a lot of interesting information regarding the history of the domestication of this tree. But anyway, this is it's about the science. So yeah. Yeah, sorry. I don't know if you guys have more questions.
I just want to refer that actually in our first year and second year event, we had artists who applied conductive ink and conductive fiber and mix it with this paper mulberry technique. So yes. They were using this material for wearables, but we haven't given rich knowledge about it. So that's why I think this year is perfect to invite you here. Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, it was super. Thank you.
Yeah, this culture actually revived now in many places. For example, in Taiwan, there are many workshops. They started to make the tapa cloth now in Taiwan, and this culture is actually reviving in Hawaii. And there are still very there are still many people making traditional tapa cloths in Tonga, of course. But in other islands, for example, islands that this culture long gone, people trying to revive this culture now. And I think it's really great. Yeah, so it's really great to see this revival.
But for in what aspect?
They try to make the tapa cloth again, and basically they are good souvenir basically, and in all those like Polynesian island. And for example, in a traditional ceremony, you need a tapa cloth for your like a garment, you know, those like clothes, yeah. And for example, in the Hawaiian hula dance, that was the traditional one. You need to have a tapa as a belt. Okay, different culture all use these things, but for long period of time, they were replaced by modern fabric. But now people realize if you want to really perform like a traditional culture, you need to use a real material, and you need to make a real tapa cloth. Yeah, and they also have some like attach different like a meaning to it. So yeah, there's a lot of this is happening now. So it's actually wonderful. Yeah. Any more questions?
I do have one question. Yeah, by my understanding, I just know this how to say that the early Taiwanese government, they use it to make the cash note. Is it true?
In paper mulberry, because they have a very long fiber, so the paper made from the paper mulberry is very strong. You want your paper, cash paper, to be very strong, right? So the paper mulberry fiber is actually one of the big base fiber to make a paper note, the money note, yes. And so there's a common name of paper mulberry in Taiwan. It's called cash tree, 钞票树.
Yeah.
And actually, it was documented in the literature that in Southern Song Dynasty, you know, the Nansong 时期, one of the reasons the Nansong dynasty they were just, you know, they were invaded by the Mongolian. It's really because during that period of time, they could not find enough paper mulberry tree to make their paper note, their cash. So there's a lot of the fake paper not made of the paper mulberry tree, and that there's like an inflation because of there are too many fake money, and that was actually one of the reasons triggering the demise of the dynasty. So it's because of the material. It's very, very unique. Yeah. But nowadays, when people when they make the money paper, now it's not only paper mulberry. They have a lot of the different like fibers, using like a very long plastic fiber, of course, because you need a lot of the material to prevent the how to say that the fabric, the fake money. So nowadays, there's, as far as I know, the paper is not made of the pure paper mulberry. They are part of the material, but they will also mix with many different kinds of fiber. Yeah, yeah. I know that was a very complicated issue now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And anyone has questions, you are free to ask.
Yeah, I hope you guys will convince that Taiwan is the homeland of Austronesian-speaking people. For me, that is the most important thing here.
I know some of us, we have interest to find the relations between the fiber materials and how yeah, I know, like Victoria's work is just exploring how geography influence the technologies, and like you can also find the similar properties in different weaving cultures. They are not, in the ancient time, we are not connected, but we share the super similar properties.
Yeah. In the Pacific, actually, the different culture very often have different way of making tapa cloth, and also they dye it differently. So different culture have different motif. Some of the motif are very specific. So I know there are some anthropology, they actually study the motif on the tapa cloth. And there are actually they actually also record a lot of the different cultural phenomena. For example, during the 19th century, when those Pacific islands, they started to be colonized, or they started to be influenced by Western culture, a lot of the things they saw at that time, I mean, the indigenous population in the Pacific, they recorded a lot of the interesting phenomena in the tapa cloth. So a lot of people actually study this, like the pattern, the motif they draw or they paint on the tapa cloth. And there are actually some people actually study this different patterning. And there are actually a lot of research being done. And also people are also trying to use the pattern itself to reconstruct the evolution of the pattern, the motif, and trying to relay that to the Austronesian migration or navigation. Yeah, so it's just a very interesting material. Yeah.
You mean by the pattern on the paper mulberry textile?
Yeah, the tapa cloth. Yeah. If you remember the PPT I showed in the Tupi festival, those motifs are very different from the one you can observe in other Pacific islands. Yeah, actually, each tribe, all have their unique motif. Yeah. But I have to admit that my specialty is about the plant DNA. So a lot of the archaeology or anthropology was not really my expertise. So I basically, so this is why I have this title called the botanist pursuit in Pacific anthropology. Is really, I'm a botanist. For me, it's really unexpected that I get into this field and yeah, enjoy it so much so far. Yeah.
Super.
Okay. Any more questions? People still here?
Yes.
No.
Yeah, I think
question. Anyone typing any?
Hi, I have a question actually. So I know you just mentioned that you know, your experiences in botany, not the anthropological historical aspect necessarily, but I'm really curious about, first of all, I am familiar with the mulberry plant. I use a lot of kozo paper, which is Japanese mulberry, in my work, which is marbling. So I need a paper that is thin, really strong fibers that won't dissolve when submerged into water. So I love kozo plant and just mulberry plants in general. But I'm really curious, I did not know about the history of tapa clothing or its use in clothing. And I wonder if you have any more information historically or anthropologically about why the mulberry plant was not used, is not continued to be used in China or other parts of Asia for clothing, and why it has culturally remained as something, a material for clothing in Polynesia.
Okay, so I think it's really, for some reason, the weaving technology never transported into the Polynesian. So if you look at the range of Austronesian-speaking people, the Pacific, when the Europeans arrived in the Pacific, they just don't have the weaving textile. And the thing is, when an area you have a weaving textile, paper mulberry was replaced easily because the tapa cloth is just not that durable compared to the weaving textile. So when you have a weaving textile, the tapa cloth or bark cloth was never used for clothing. Do you understand what I mean? So that is why they kind of like disappear. They only survive as a traditional, like a material cultural icon, but they never survive as a daily uses. For example, when the Pacific people, when they received the Western textile, they basically abandoned the use of the tapa cloth for daily life. But before that, they use that for daily life. They actually, every day they use it well as that. But when they have the Western textile, simply because it takes a lot of energy and time to make a tapa cloth. I don't know if this answers your question. And so they survive. And so that is why it's actually in a lot of the culture, the tapa cloth survives as more like a paper kind of thing. For example, in Java, they use basically tapa cloth to print their Quran. When the Indonesia, they become like an Islamic culture. And for them, the tapa cloth is very, very important culturally. So there are some Quran, I mean the Bible of the Islam Bible, they need to use the tapa cloth to print their Quran. So that kind of transformed into a culturally very, very important things. Okay, but I want to go back to the Kozo paper you mentioned. Kozo is actually a paper mulberry tree. It's not a, when you say Japanese paper mulberry, it's actually, it was a hybrid paper mulberry tree. The Kozo tree is a hybrid between a paper mulberry tree and a related tree species, what we call, I think they call that Japanese paper mulberry tree. And Kozo is a hybrid one. The Kozo is made of this hybrid paper mulberry tree. And this hybrid has a much stronger fiber, so you can make a very, very thin paper. This thin paper, I believe you know, it's called washi paper. And it was made from the Kozo, and Kozo is the hybrid paper mulberry. And in Japan, they actually use this washi paper to make clothes. I don't know if you know this. Yeah, I actually visit a workshop in Sendai region, and they show me how they can make a very, very fine kimoko using the paper. Yeah, so I don't know if this answer your question, yeah.
It did, thank you. That's really interesting. I did not know that history. I was wondering if maybe, you know, in China, the biodiversity there, if they had more of a reliance on other crops for clothing fibers, if that played a part into that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually cannot answer your question because I'm not expert on that thing. But I do know that in southern China, they do, in Yunnan province, they do use a different kind of tree to make. Actually, I did not mention this. Paper mulberry tree can be made using a lot of different species. For example, paper mulberry, of course, is the finest. There's a lot of people using a ficus tree, a banyan tree, a fig tree, basically. And also, some people use Artocarpus, basically breadfruit. Another very important material is hibiscus. Hibiscus tiliaceus is a very common, widespread Pacific tree, and the fiber is also very strong. But for me, it's because I focus on paper mulberry tree. But also in the Western Africa, there's also tapa culture. They use also a fig tree, ficus tree, basically. And I believe in Central Mexico, Central America, also have a tapa culture. And as far as I know, they all use the ficus tree. And in terms of the taxonomy, they are all belong to the family Moraceae, the mulberry family. And that's suggesting a lot of the tree species in this mulberry family, they have a very long fiber in the bark, yeah. So it's not really specified in a specific tree, but for my purposes, it's really to trace the migration of Austronesian people, not the material itself. So, but anyway, paper mulberry turned out to be a very perfect material for our study, yeah. Yes, any more questions? Yeah, if you have more, this is my email. If you guys have more question about like other related thing, you can just email me. I can send you more information.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you if we can continue, give you questions somewhere.
Oh, yeah. Just yeah.
That's super.
We actually continue this. One of the project I'm actually doing now is actually, I want to understand the origin of Kozo better actually. But unfortunately, I actually got a grant to study Kozo in Japan and Korea. But unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I could not go to Japan and Korea. So really caused me a lot of trouble, yeah. But because they are basically paper mulberry related species, so I would like to, it's kind of like my journey, this really becoming a very, I just interested in the paper mulberry tree, yeah. So I want to know this, the tree better, yeah. We also want trying to study the process of domestication of this tree, exactly how, I have an idea is that my hypothesis is when the Austronesian people, they left Taiwan, they did not randomly just pick one tree. They actually selected, they knew there are a very, very fine tree in that village that is the best tree for make tapa cloth. And the people, they select that tree. And that particular tree got to be transported all across the Pacific. And that is why we can make these studies, because I think they select a very specific individual, yeah. And that for me is a very important evidence suggesting Austronesian expansion and migration is really a farmer's expansion and migration, because they have the ability to select a specifically clone. And that's a very important of the symbol. They are good farmers. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk.